Then there's organizational advocacy. And this is when you are specifically advocating for an organization. And again, this could just be about sharing information. So going back to your, place of worship and sharing information about all of these organizations that are in this fantastic virtual exhibit hall, attending an advocacy event. So guess what? You're all engaging in organizational advocacy right now. And I certainly encourage you to join us on November 14th as well. Maybe it's about volunteering or fundraising for an organization. All of that goes into organizational advocacy. Next is media advocacy. So this is one of those things that a lot of people feel is really daunting and very scary and, think, well, wait a minute, like I'm not a professional, I don't want to be interviewed, or I can't write, so I don't necessarily, how could I engage in media advocacy? Well, it doesn't have to be complicated, and it certainly shouldn't be something that you're not comfortable with. So if you are disclosing widely what you are going through, certainly writing a blog or an article or an op-ed for a local newspaper, maybe you want to give an interview about your experience. But if all of that still seems like a lot, perhaps the easiest way to engage in media advocacy is by using social media. And of course, we'd want everyone to think through their disclosure decisions, but even if someone's choosing not to disclose widely about their personal experience, you can still use social media to share information or resources or advocate for something. And the way that you can do that is you literally just don't say it's about you. So for example, I am not a cancer survivor, and yet I am frequently sharing information about different organizations and opportunities for learning on my social media because I want as many people as possible to learn about what might be available to them. So, I have my own personal handles that are mostly just personal, pictures of the dog and the kid and whatnot. But then, of course, we have our organizational handles as well. And so find any organization that you're interested in, search for them on social media and follow them, tag them, like their posts. It really does help as an organization. Now, interestingly enough, social media has also become a way to engage in policy and legislative advocacy as well. So even prior to this current administration, elected officials were starting to use social media to engage with their elected officials. And I am so surprised at how responsive and quick many elected officials are on social media. And I did a little test the other day, and I sent my Senator Durbin from Illinois, a letter through his electronic portal, and I tweeted at him on the same day. I received a response to my tweet that same day. It took approximately 3 weeks for me to get a letter back from him in the mail as response to my electronic note. So while I don't think that we'll ever fully get rid of the formalized process of writing elected officials letters, for things that are particularly time sensitive, social media is a great way to connect with them, and it's socially distant. So moving right on down, we have scientific advocacy. Now, again, many different ways to be a scientific advocate. It could be about participating in clinical trials or research studies, but it could also just be advocating for more funding or attending trainings. Many grant entities are looking for people to act as peer reviewers. And so you literally would be one of the people that reads all of the applications for grants and decides which are the most appropriate for that body to provide money to. Those opportunities exist in many, many places, not just at the federal sort of national levels, but check out local foundations that are operating in your communities and ask if they're looking for peer reviewers. That is a way to engage in scientific advocacy. But it could also just be something as simple as answering a survey. So my guess is that you all are going to be asked by a Kieran site to complete an evaluation about what you thought of today's session or what you thought about the conference as a whole. those evaluations are imperative for organizations like ours to be able to continue providing the services that we provide for free. And so you taking the time to provide honest, thoughtful, and thorough feedback is not only helping the organization, but you're engaging in scientific advocacy. Now, moving on to policy advocacy. So policy advocacy often gets confused with legislative advocacy, and it's not really the same thing. So policy advocacy is anytime you are talking to the people in charge and either supporting or asking for a change in a particular policy. So it could be about asking your employer to change the policy in, dress code would be an example of policy advocacy. Or it could be about an example that we're seeing all over the country right now is people who are taking to the streets and protesting on both sides, school closures due to the current pandemic we're living in. And so those people are engaging in policy advocacy because they're not really advocating for a change in the law. They're advocating for a change in that school district's or that school's policy to be either distance learning or not, depending on which side they're on. It could also be about testifying for a legislative body at a hearing on a particular issue. So not about a specific piece of legislation, but just an issue. So for example, earlier this year, I was asked to testify for Congress about the issue of paid family leave and the lack of paid family leave in this country, and why it has become particularly important for individuals in the cancer community, given our current global pandemic. So there wasn't a piece of legislation I was pointing to. I was really just talking about the issue. That is policy advocacy. Now, perhaps the most in-depth way to engage in policy advocacy is to actually submit comments on regulations that are submitted. Now, the way that our system works is once a law is passed, many of the agencies like the Department of Labor or Health and Human Services or the IRS are then tasked with writing specific regulations to carry out what's included in the legislation. And the way that it works is they will submit draft regulations or interim regulations, and then there's a comment period. And that's the opportunity for anybody who is interested to write comments. So it could be about how a particular regulation is going to impact individuals with ocular melanoma. And you might think I don't have the ability to do that, but there are some tools out there that could be helpful. And certainly I would recommend engaging in a little research to find out who else is working on those particular issues. So again, policy advocacy can occur on many, many levels, but it's very important because lots happens on a policy level, not just on a legislative level. That being said, we're going to spend the rest of the day talking about legislative advocacy. So in my introduction, it was mentioned that I am in fact a cancer rights attorney. And the reason that we need cancer rights attorneys is because there are so many tools and benefits that are available to the cancer community that are rooted in the law. And the reason that we have so many tools and benefits and we have all of these resources to provide is because legislative advocates engaged and ended up with laws. And so when I talk about legislative advocacy, I talk about it with a couple of different hats on. So certainly from my current hat of a cancer rights attorney, trying to help individuals in the community navigate all of the practical and legal issues. But before I was a cancer rights attorney, I actually worked for a senator and a congresswoman. And so I really have, I think, a unique view in how laws are created and how important advocates are to that process, and how we need, quote unquote, everyday Americans to be engaging in the process in order to get good laws at the end. So when we talk about legislative advocacy, generally we're talking about working to achieve a legislative outcome. So a law, a budget, a resolution, those are all created legislatively. So how can you engage in legislative advocacy? Lots of different ways. So I think perhaps the easiest thing to do, specifically around a piece of law, would be to meet with your elected officials. And it's important to remember that we're not just talking about the federal officials. So who are your state elected officials? Who are your local elected officials? I did this presentation a couple, well, it was pre-pandemic, so it was more than a couple of months ago. But a gentleman said to me, well, isn't it sort of wasting my time to be dealing with my city councilmen when I could be going to my state reps or my federal reps? And the issue was about paid leave. And so I informed him that most of, or many of, the people that have access to paid leave under the law have it at the city or county level, not at the state level, and certainly not yet at the federal level. And so it's valuable to look at who's really been pushing for a particular policy and starting there, and that could be at your city level. Now, I think that part of why legislative advocacy can feel a little overwhelming for people is because there's a lot of different terms that are thrown out. And I'm always surprised when I'm listening to the news at how often they get it wrong. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, I just want to talk about a couple quick terms. So a bill is a proposed law. So it's introduced for consideration. When we're talking about federal level, you can tell which body, legislative body, the bill is in based on the number. So if it has HR before the number, then it's in the House of Representatives. There's an S in front of it, then it's in the Senate. When we talk about a public law or an act, that means it's actually been, the bill has been passed by both houses and signed by the president. And those are going to be given to you with a Pub L, so a public law. When we talk about the district, that's the geographic area of a city, state, county that's represented by the legislator, excuse me. Now, constituent is a very powerful word, and it's one I encourage you to use when you are engaging in legislative advocacy. It really just means that you are a citizen that lives within that district of the particular legislator. But guess what that means? That means you are that elected official's boss, and you have power over whether or not they get reelected, and they absolutely should be listening to you. They are working for you. Now, who are your elected officials? Again, it's going to depend on what level we're talking about. If we're talking about the federal level, we have senators and U.S. representatives. Every state gets 2 senators. The number of representatives we have is actually based on states' population. So California is going to have more representatives than New Hampshire. One of the confusing things for a lot of people is, well, we always call senators senators. Sometimes we call representatives representatives. Sometimes we call them congressmen. So when you hear those are actually interchangeable. At the state level, of course, we have our governor, our state senators, assembly members. These terms might vary slightly based on your specific state. And then locally, again, we're going to have Board of Supervisors, City Council. In Chicago, where I'm from, we have aldermen, your school board. But once you figure out who you're trying to talk to, then you have to figure out who they are. And this is going to be addressed. And to, and you can type in your address and it will tell you who your elected officials are. I really love Common Causes. It's nonpartisan, but what I love about it is it tells you all of your elected officials in one place, from president on down to city council members. So instead of having to go to each website separately, it's all there for you. So once you've figured out who your elected officials are, there's several different ways you can communicate with them. So certainly you can call them, you can send faxes, you can email, you can write letters. You could potentially go and have a capital meeting. We're all just going to assume that COVID is going to end at some point and we will go back to having in-person meetings. But capital meetings, if you're talking about your federal elected officials, are going to occur in DC. You're talking about your state elected officials, it's going to occur in your state capital. But many people don't realize that every elected official also has a district office. So an office within the geographic area of their district. So if you are not interested in traveling, but you still want to meet face-to-face, you can actually call the district office and ask for an appointment for the next time that that elected official is going to be in town. But the other great thing is that it doesn't always have to be formal. And so many elected officials will host or participate in community events like festivals and fairs and parades and job fairs. So find out where they're going to be. Most of them have newsletters, or you can find out on their social media where they're going to be and go engage with them there. Walk up, introduce yourself, and have a conversation. The most important thing that you can share with your elected officials, and it probably should be something in the first part of the introduction, is that you are a constituent. Because at that point, those elected officials know that you're their boss and that they need to be listening to you and having a conversation with you. So in addition to reminding them or telling them that you are a constituent, these are just some tips to communicate with an elected official. And I recognize that, some of these sound pretty basic, but they can really have a big impact. And I think some of this comes again from my past job, where we were often, as staff members of the elected officials, abused a little bit in some ways. So I really recommend to be kind, especially if you are calling elected officials. The person who picks up the phone is not the elected official. It is probably an intern who's getting paid nothing, or a staff assistant who gets paid very little, whose job it is to pick up the phone and take the messages. So even if you are thoroughly upset with the elected official, just remember that the person on the phone only has so much power. Also, be prepared to leave your address. So this isn't because they want to invade your privacy, but it is typically because A, they want to check that you're a constituent, and B, most elected officials will send a response letter back, even to phone calls. So they're going to need your address. I think it's always helpful to use proper titles. So Senator so-and-so or Congressman so-and-so. It shows a respect and deference to the position that they hold. If you are calling about a specific piece of legislation, really helpful to include a bill or resolution number so that they know exactly what you're talking about, because there may actually be lots of bills out there floating around on a particular topic. So if you just say, please support the paid family leave bill, that doesn't actually tell them necessarily what you want them to do. But it is helpful to include an ask. In fact, I pretty much think it's the most important thing next to I'm a constituent. What's the ask? What do you want them to do? Support this bill, oppose this nomination, continue working hard for us. Whatever it is that you want them to do, make sure that ask is very clear. Now, if we get back to the point where we're having in-person meetings and you want to have that in their office, make an appointment. Certainly, they will occasionally make time for drop-ins, but I have to tell you, at least on the federal level, we would have upwards of 30 meetings a day. And so it was sometimes very hard to squeeze in drop-ins for people who didn't have appointments. And that didn't feel good for us as staff who wanted to meet with constituents. So always really helpful to try to make an appointment. which leads me to my next point. Many times, many times you will end up speaking with a staff member and not the elected official themselves. And that can be a little disappointing and that can be a little bit of a letdown, but sometimes it's actually better for the cause. The way that it works in, certainly in federal and probably in state, is the staff is divided up and each staff member has a portfolio of issues. And those staff members become close to experts on the particular issue. Whereas the elected official has to be a generalist, so to speak. They have to know a little bit about a lot. So if you're really digging into a particular issue or a particular bill, it can actually be more beneficial for you to meet with that staff member than with the elected official themselves. Certainly keep groups small. If you've ever been to a congressional office, they are tiny. There's just not a lot of physical room. You may end up meeting in the hallway or the cafeteria. All of that is normal and to be expected. I also think it's really helpful to take some sort of leave behind. So something that will jog the staff members or the Congress members' memory when they go back to their desks. Remember how I said you could have about 30 meetings a day? At some point, it all starts to get a little mushy in your brain. And so it can be really helpful if you go back to your desk, sorting through your notes to say, oh yeah, these were the folks that were advocating for ocular melanoma, and this is what they were asking for. And here's the person that I can contact if I need something else. So it doesn't have to be fancy or professionally done, but anything that can be helpful, anything that you can leave behind can be very helpful. And then finally, I think it is a nice touch for you to ask if there's anything that you can do for them. It should be a two-way street. It should be about what your elected officials can do for you, but also what are ways as a constituent that you can help your elected official do a better job. And so it could just be about vote. They might just say, make sure to go vote on November 3rd. It could be about, could you testify at a hearing? Or could you start a letter writing campaign to this other member? So there's all sorts of things they might ask you for. But I guarantee you, many staff members will be surprised to have a situation where you, as an advocate and a constituent, actually ask if there's anything that you can do to be helpful. So that's another little hidden tip for you. After a meeting, if you've had it either in person or over Zoom, because I know they are having Zoom meetings with constituents, sending a thank you note's a really nice tip. I recommend sending an email and a hard copy letter. And here's the reason. So an email is quick, immediate. They know, you've just met with them. It's the next day, potentially. Thanks for meeting with me. As a reminder, this is what we talked about, and I would like the Congresswoman to support Bill 552. Please let me know if there's any other information that you need. Monica Bryant, 62, blah, 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 Chicago, Illinois. That's going to go in the email. It's also going to go in my hard copy. And in my hard copy, I'm probably going to add a business card or another handout. You might be thinking, well, why would you do both? Isn't that overkill? The reason I suggest doing both is the email gets lost or gets responded to and is never thought of again. The hard copy note comes approximately 2 weeks later because of congressional mail. It takes forever for hard copy things to get into Congress. That is another opportunity to jog that staffer's memory about your position and about who you are and that you met with them. So it is a nice touch to do both things if you can. So here's just a quick sample of what would be included. Thank you for meeting with me. I really appreciated the opportunity to share my experience. It can be helpful if you've had, if you had a personal story you told, just a quick sentence. I was so happy to have the opportunity to share my experience with you about when I lost my job due to my cancer diagnosis. I appreciate your support. Please vote yes on blah, blah, blah. Here's some background, and here are all the ways in which you can contact me. So it doesn't have to be a lot, but it's very, very important. Now, you might be wondering, well, okay, how am I supposed to know what I want them to vote yes or no on, or support or not support? In that case, I'm going to give you some things that's happening right now, but if you're interested in trying to figure out what bills are pending in Congress, I introduce you to Congress.gov. So this is the website that houses all of the information about what's going on at the federal level. Now, many states have a state equivalent to this. Not all of them are as sophisticated, but they will be able to at least tell you what's pending currently. So here I typed in cancer in the search tool up here, and what I learned was, oops, sorry about that. What I learned was that there are 240 different items that include the word cancer in them. I narrowed it down. On the left-hand side, I only want to see legislation, so I don't want to see committee stuff, and I only want to see this Congress. Ignore the dates here, it's an old image. But you can narrow it down by show me what happened last Congress, show me what happened this Congress, show me in all time what's happened. And then I want to learn a little bit more about this law here. So I click on S292. I can see who introduced it. I can see, I can see who introduced it. I can see where it is in the process. So when it's grayed out, that's the point in the process. So this particular bill became a law. I can read a summary down here of the bill. I can see all of the co-sponsors. I can also get alerts. Now, I really like this tool, especially if there's a specific law that I'm following. I'm not going to check Congress.gov every day. So I created a free account and I sign in, name and email address, and then I can hit get alerts. And anytime something changes with the particular piece of legislation, I get an email. So new co-sponsors, or it's moved out of committee, or there's going to be a vote on it. All of that information just arrives in my email. And if I want to learn more, I can then click to come back in here and get more. So really helpful if you are interested in engaging in legislative advocacy. So I mentioned co-sponsors because one of the things that you could potentially ask your elected officials to do to show their support for a bill is to co-sponsor. So co-sponsoring means that their name goes on the bill. So they're not the original sponsors. They're not the people who wrote the law or introduced the law, but they are people who have decided to throw their hat in behind supporting a piece of legislation before it gets voted on. And co-sponsors can be really helpful because if you have a bill that has hundreds of co-sponsors, that's an indication to the committees that this is a bill with lots of interest behind it and maybe should get moved forward. It's also really helpful if a bill is never going to get called for a vote, so maybe it's a minority sponsored bill. This is a way for elected officials to go on the record that they support what's included in the bill, even if they aren't going to have a chance to vote on it. So before you ask your member to co-sponsor a particular piece of legislation, it's always helpful to make sure that they aren't already a co-sponsor. So if we go back to the screen I was just showing you, you can see here towards the bottom, it says summary and text, and amendments, and co-sponsors. So you click on co-sponsors, and this is what it shows you. And you can scroll to find your member. You can look by state. You can look by what party they affiliate with. And if they aren't included on this list, then asking them to co-sponsor is a great thing to do. If they are included on this list and you're going to go have a meeting with them, saying thank you for co-sponsoring the bill is a great thing to do. It also shows a level of sophistication in your advocacy skills that you've already done this background research, that you've looked it up and you understand what all of these things mean. So in the last couple of minutes that I have with you, I just wanted to talk about a couple of current legislative issues that you might be there. Family and Medical Insurance Leave Act, or the Family Act, and this is about providing paid family leave. There's a bill pending in the House to end the 5-month waiting period that currently exists for Social Security disability insurance. Medicaid expansion is on many state ballots. Expanding the definition of family. So right now, under the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act, a caregiver can only take job protected leave for a seriously ill child, parent, or spouse, which is a pretty narrow definition of family. So you couldn't take job protected leave under the FMLA for a sibling or an aunt or a grandparent or a parent-in-law. And so there are several efforts to try to expand that definition of family for that specific purpose. And then there are some efforts to provide paid family leave for individuals who are immunocompromised, specifically around COVID. So if you're interested in any of these, we've talked about some of them in our blog, and on our advocacy page on the website, we have links to letters and more information as well. But the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is a pending court case that you may or may not know much about. So under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or the ACA, or Obamacare, all the same thing, there is a requirement to have health insurance. And if you don't have health insurance, then you have to pay a penalty. This was referred to as the individual mandate. Now, lots of debates and feelings about this individual mandate, but it only really applied to about 2% of Americans, because all of these things that I have listed here count as coverage. So individual plans, employer plans, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans, all of that's coverage. But if you didn't have one of these things and you didn't fall into a long list of exceptions, then you would pay a penalty. Now, in 2017, Congress passed a tax bill in which they lowered the penalty to $0. So the penalty still exists, it's just now $0. This caused all sorts of confusion because many people now thought, oh, this doesn't exist, the ACA doesn't exist anymore, it's gone. That's not the case. But what reducing the penalty to $0 triggered was a series of events that led to a court case. So in February of 2018, the Texas Attorney General, 17 other states' attorneys generals, 2 governors, and 2 individual Texans brought suit challenging the constitutionality of the ACA. They said now that the penalty was $0, Congress didn't have the right to pass the ACA and it should all go away. In June of 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice, which is the federal entity that is in charge of defending federal laws in court, said, no thanks, we're not interested, not going to be there. But we think most of the ACA should go away, but some parts you can keep. That was June 7th. The very next day, the California Attorney General and 16 other states' attorneys general asked the court if they could step in for the role of the Department of Justice. So now you have a situation where you have 19 states on one end and 17 states on the other fighting over the constitutionality of the ACA in a Texas court. In December of 2018, the Texas judge ruled all of the ACA was unconstitutional, but then stayed or put on hold that decision until we could figure out where the appeals were going to go. So then very shortly thereafter, the California and Democratic states attorneys general appealed. We had an election, so some states joined, some states left. The House of Representatives asked to join, but now, a year later, now the Department of Justice says, you remember how we said, let's keep some of it? Now we think strike it all, get rid of everything. July, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals heard the case, and in December, they upheld the decision of the lower Texas court saying that it was unconstitutional, but sent it back down to the Texas court to say, figure out if it all has to go away or if some of the pieces can be kept, which is ironic because that judge has already made a decision that it should all go away. So almost immediately, both sides appealed up to the Supreme Court. Again, we had some states join. We had a pandemic. So the Supreme Court, which is SCOTUS, is the Supreme Court of the United States, suspended oral arguments. They started doing some oral arguments via Zoom. They said they're going to hear the arguments on November 10th. Now the case is called California v. Texas. And a few weeks ago, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. So now there's an open seat on the Supreme Court. So here are the 6 possible outcomes of that Supreme Court case. The first is that the Supreme Court upholds the Affordable Care Act. Now, this would require 2 justices, most likely Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh, to join with the 3 more liberal justices to uphold the ACA. If that happens, the case ends and we all move forward. The second scenario is a 4-4 tie, which means that the Fifth Circuit Court ruling stands and it goes back down to that original Texas judge to make a decision to see how much of the law can survive, if any. Chances are, if he says scrap it all, then the appeals process starts all over and we end up back at the Supreme Court eventually. But that leaves many, many months, perhaps years of limbo around what's happening with health insurance. Option 3 is the Supreme Court says, well, we're only going to strike what's called guaranteed issue and community rating because those are most closely tied to the individual mandate. Well, in that case, we lose the protection against discrimination for people with pre-existing conditions, and insurance companies can now charge people with pre-existing conditions whatever they want. So the practical reality of that decision is somewhere between 20 and 133 million people that have pre-existing conditions in this country lose health insurance. Option 4, the Supreme Court decides the whole Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. We know 3 justices will probably rule this way. Again, Chief Justice Roberts and Kavanaugh are sort of unknowns, but the biggest unknown is whoever is going to sit in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat. If the Supreme Court rules the ACA is unconstitutional, the case ends, and again, somewhere between 20 and 133 million people are left without health insurance. Option 5 is the Supreme Court punts completely. So they could do this in 2 ways. They could postpone oral arguments, which I highly doubt would happen, or they could hear oral arguments on November 10th. But if there isn't someone sitting in that seat on November 10th, they could actually rehear the case once there are 9 justices. And so that kind of kicks the can down the road on a decision. The very last option is, depending on the election and depending on what Congress decides to do, if the Supreme Court doesn't make a decision and in January a new Congress is seated, they could actually pass legislation right away to reinstate the penalty. And if that penalty is reinstated, then the case becomes moot and the Affordable Care Act lives another day. So I walk through all of that because we have been finding, as we do hundreds of presentations a year, that most Americans don't really know that this whole court case is going on, or they have an idea that it's something is happening, but they don't really understand all of the details. And why would you? Like, this is in the weeds legal stuff, and we all have other things to be doing. But I did just want to talk through it because for communities that I often present to with individuals with pre-existing conditions, this is important. And so if you want to read more in depth about what I've just talked about, we have 2 blogs currently up on our blog and that explain more and provide links to some other resources as well. So, excuse me, you might be thinking, okay, I feel one way or the other about this. What can I actually do about it? Well, there's several ways to get involved. Certainly you can be an advocate on your own, send emails, write a letter to the media, share your story, get on social media. You could join an organization's advocacy efforts. So many cancer organizations have advocacy efforts. The American Cancer Societies and the cancer support communities are pan-cancer, so they're not specific to a type of cancer. But the easiest and perhaps most important thing that you can do to be a legislative advocate right now is to vote. Because if you don't vote, you don't get to complain, at least to me. And I realize it sounds sort of harsh and you all don't know me, but I feel very strongly that we are, as Americans, so fortunate to have a say in who our elected officials are, that if we don't participate in the process, we lose our right to complain about it. Because cancer is a legal and unfortunately now a political issue, and it wasn't always. So I really encourage you to use your voice. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is how I feel. This lady's crazy. I don't have time to be super advocate. I get it. I really, really do. But engaging in advocacy doesn't have to be very time consuming. So this is a screenshot of an email or an action alert that was sent to my colleague, who is a member of the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network. I think it costs $15 a year to join. She gets these emails. You can see here, there's a link. So it describes the issue. There's a link. She clicks the link. She types her name and her address and hits send. And the system sends the letter to the right elected official. So it probably takes, what, 10 minutes? Or excuse me, 30 seconds to a minute to type in your name and address. And I bet we could all probably find that. So I know we're coming up on 10 minutes, but I did just want to walk through quickly thinking about what are the characteristics of a successful advocate. And I know that you might be sitting there thinking, well, I'm just one person and what impact can I have? And I would argue a huge one. We have seen over and over and over again how narrow elections are and how important hearing from constituents is to those elected officials. But successful advocates also have to have a passion and a commitment for change and working towards what they care about. And I would venture that you wouldn't all be spending your time on a virtual meeting today if you didn't have that passion. But it also takes a willingness to collaborate. And that could be with other members in your community. That could be across, disease types, across cancer types. Sometimes we all get into our little silos of like-minded people, but collaboration is incredibly powerful and very important. And this is just an example of an opportunity that we as Triage Cancer were able to engage in a few years ago when there were efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And we got to join with all of these cancer organizations, but also with other organizations that had nothing to do with cancer, like the Multiple Sclerosis Society, because we all have a vested interest in making sure that people with pre-existing conditions can't be discriminated against. So collaboration is huge. Now, successful advocates know that they have to be patient and persistent, and this can be really hard, especially if you're like me and you like instant gratification. But it is just so incredibly important. It can take multiple congressional sessions for a bill to even get a hearing, let alone a vote. And here I have a picture of the late Senator Edward Kennedy, who worked for healthcare reform for his entire tenure at the US Senate. He introduced his first healthcare reform bill in 1970. And it wasn't until 7 months after he passed away that the Affordable Care Act was signed into law. That was 2010. So for perspective, he worked on healthcare reform through 8 different presidents, 7 terms in Congress, and 40 years to get a bill passed, and it's still not perfect. So persistence, persistence, persistence.
Hi, Monica.
Yes.
Thank you so much. There's a bunch of stuff. There's a bunch of comments here in the chat. People are loving the presentation. We have got a 5-minute break. We've got a couple more minutes that we've got to move into the other tracks. But I would love to, if you could send us your presentation, we can put it into Socio and people can reference it. And of course, they can connect with you on the platform as well. Is that something you'd be willing to do with us?
Absolutely.
That'd be awesome. So thank you so much. And I would love to have a chance to meet you off of the presentation view also. But we're going to try and hop off here and head into a break because we've got about 4 minutes until we have our other presentation. All right. Now we have a break coming up. And let's see what's next here. Okay. We'll be back in just a couple minutes.